A kind family hired a troubled but captivating woman as a maid, who ended up changing their lives. In 1971, Buddy returns to Glennville, Georgia, to visit his father. Seeing his childhood home, he suddenly feels nostalgic as he gazes at the bridge over the river. He remembers an old family friend who once lived with them, the first woman he ever loved outside of his family. However, his father disliked her because she always caused trouble. When Buddy was 13, he saw a captivating woman crossing the bridge and walking toward his house. She introduced herself as Rose, who came to live with them as the family's maid. Buddy quickly rushed into the house and told his mother, Mrs. Hillyer, who wore a hearing aid. When she asked him his impression of the woman, the teenager described her as tall and youthful. Then, the delighted mother introduced Rose to her other two children, Doll and Wasky. Just at that moment, the head of the family, Wilcox, arrived. He welcomed Rose, praising her grace and expressing confidence in her abilities despite her challenging experiences in Birmingham. Intrigued, Buddy couldn't help but wonder more about her past. The next day, Rose played the harmonica for the children by the river while Buddy watched her from afar, growing more and more curious about her. Later, while the children were in the kitchen, Rose asked Buddy about the hotel his family managed. In response, the teenager explained that his mother, orphaned at an early age, had inherited the property. Suddenly, Buddy asked Rose about her experiences in Birmingham. Although she tried to dodge the question, the teenager guessed that she had been hired by her father to help her escape a life as a courtesan. Later, Wilcox came home for lunch and ordered Rose coffee. After praising her service, he playfully spanked her, causing her to run away. Upon witnessing this reaction, Mrs. Hillyer suspected that the maid was feeling unwell, but Buddy commented that it had to do with his helper's apparent infatuation with her father. The next day, while sweeping in the backyard, Rose noticed Mrs. Hillyer studying, which piqued her curiosity. Upon learning that she was about to finish her master's degree, the maid admired her more. When Mrs. Hillyer also revealed that she had been orphaned at age 7, the maid felt a deeper connection to her, having been orphaned herself. While this was going on, the children watched from the tree house. Doll commented that her mother had not realized that Rose was in love with her father. Buddy suggested that it might be because her mother's maternal instincts were stronger than malice. Later, during the meal, Rose played She Loves Me Not with the beans while looking at Wilcox, which Doll noticed. When she accidentally spilled them, Mrs. Hillyer quickly checked on her, but the maid assured her she was fine. Then Mrs. Hillyer suddenly remembered her presentation in the magazine. Wilcox insisted on taking her to the place, but she refused, suggesting that he stay home and help the maid with the dishes. After their mother left, Buddy and Doll secretly watched their father and the maid in the dining room. They saw Rose trying to kiss him, confessing her romantic feelings to him. However, Wilcox rebuffed her advances, advising her to calm down and talk things over. Despite this, Rose insisted that he kiss her at least once, leading Wilcox to relent. When things were about to become passionate, Wilcox stopped and confronted Rose, accusing her of seducing him without considering the impact on his wife. After instructing the maid to do the dishes, he walked out the dining room door, which sent his children running. Later, Doll and Buddy discussed what they had witnessed. While she believed her father had genuinely rejected Rose, her brother suspected he did it out of fear. Afterward, Buddy went to his room to read his comics. While he was in bed, a devastated Rose arrived unexpectedly, asking to lie next to him for a while. After the teenager allowed her to join him, the maid vented about her pain and confessed her love for her father. When Buddy asked her how she fell in love, Rose explained that it started when Wilcox complimented her on her first day. Taking advantage of the maid's vulnerable state, the curious teenager began to touch her inappropriately. She rebuffed his advances, reminding him that she was too young to be interested in such things. Despite this, he insisted that he wanted to explore her body, and she eventually allowed him to do so. Meanwhile, Wilcox woke up in the middle of the night. When his wife became concerned, he explained that the Great Depression had made him think about its devastating effects on people. To console himself, he made himself a glass of milk. Realizing what he had done to Buddy, Rose felt terrible and asked him not to tell anyone. After he promised her, she ran out, ashamed. However, when she returned to her room, Rose looked at herself in the mirror, which made her feel increasingly worried. Then she woke Buddy, begging him to keep it a secret. She feared that if people found out, they would blame her and not him. Buddy suspected that Rose's request was related to her past as a courtesan. However, the maid clarified that it was not about her past. She loved being with her family and feared that she would be thrown out if they found out what had happened. The teenager understood and promised not to tell, expressing his love for her. After thanking him and hugging him, the maid revealed her plan to move on and find the right man on her day off. The next day, Buddy woke up late, which led Mrs. Hillyer to scold him and ask what he had been doing. He then lied, saying he had been reading inappropriate comics all night. His mother expressed her disappointment and gave him castor oil to cleanse his poisoned mind. Just then, Rose showed off her outfit before leaving the house. Mrs. Hillyer and the children admired her stylish look, but Wilcox thought her clothing was provocative. Nevertheless, he and Buddy took her to town later. As Rose walked, her beauty caught the attention of several gentlemen. Meanwhile, Wilcox and Buddy continued to follow her without her knowing, watching as she successfully approached a vendor. That night, Wilcox told his wife how much Rose annoyed him, admitting that having the maid around felt tedious. However, Mrs. Hillyer only defended Rose, saying she wasn't tedious at all. As they spoke, Rose suddenly came home after her date. Later in the conversation, Wilcox commented that his maid's look made her seem like a provocative character. However, Mrs. Hillyer insisted that Wilcox should appreciate Rose's efforts to look beautiful and not be so cynical. As their discussion escalated, Mrs. Hillyer felt disrespected by her husband's contradictions. Wilcox whispered in her ear, expressing his love and respect for her, leading to their reconciliation. With the tension gone, Mrs. Hillyer calmly explained that Rose wore flashy clothing to seek affection. Although Wilcox was worried because Rose seemed to love everyone, Mrs. Hillyer defended it as a positive trait. After their conversation, the couple kissed. The next morning, while digging in the garden, Mrs. Hillyer saw a disheveled man, which scared her. She ran to the kitchen and reported it to Rose, who claimed not to know the man. In a panic, Mrs. Hillyer called her husband, who quickly returned home. Wilcox chased the man, who had escaped by swimming in the river and left his hat behind. Wilcox picked up the hat and threw it to Rose. Noticing her smile, the family became suspicious, but the maid quickly grew defensive, insisting she didn't know the man. That night, Doll complained to Buddy about Rose's lack of understanding regarding what was happening around her. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of men fighting outside the house. The brothers went out and saw a fight between two men in the garden. Meanwhile, their father, hearing the commotion, grabbed his rifle and threatened them, causing them to flee. Once the men left, he looked through Rose's window and saw her shadow. The next morning, while the maid was serving drinks to the family, Wilcox mentioned that his sleep had been interrupted and asked about hers. In response, Rose confirmed that she had heard strange voices the night before. Upset, Wilcox accused Rose of playing innocent, insisting that she knew the two men had been fighting over her. When he threatened to dismiss her, the maid firmly defended her claim, stating that she didn't know either of them. Sensing the tension, Mrs. Hillyer intervened, arguing that it was natural for Rose to have suitors and that she shouldn't be fired for that. Wilcox then explained to his wife that he didn't intend to fire Rose, but he advised the maid not to test his patience, emphasizing that they had growing children in the house. Upon hearing this, Rose promised to tell the men to stay away from the house, revealing that she had lied earlier and actually knew them. Later, Wilcox took his son to the hotel to play billiards. Their moment was interrupted when a staff member informed him that the chief of police was on the phone. After receiving the news, Buddy and Wilcox went to the police station, where the maid was being held. The officer explained that a man who admired Rose had nearly taken someone's life for her, and that she had bitten a police officer's thumb to the bone. However, the injured officer, David, intervened, believing that the woman might have been upset and hadn't intended to hurt him. Rose agreed with the police, insisting that she bit him unintentionally because she was sick. Hearing this, Wilcox disagreed, pointing out that the maid was healthy. Nevertheless, the chief released her, leaving him no choice but to take her home. Before getting out of the vehicle, Rose swore that she hadn't intended to bite the officer. Despite her explanation, Wilcox said he would return to the hotel and talk to her later. Afterward, Buddy and the maid faced the heavy rain, running toward the house. Later, while playing Chinese checkers, Doll worried about what would happen to Rose. Buddy, also curious, eavesdropped on his parents' conversation to find out their decision. The teenager heard his mother defending Rose, arguing that her intentions were good despite the biting incident. Sensing that someone was listening, Wilcox walked toward the door, causing Buddy to run and avoid being caught. Once his father returned to the room, the teenager went back to his spot to continue spying. Buddy heard his mother tell his father that Rose was not a bad influence, highlighting her loving nature. She defended that the maid attracted many men because of her big heart, not her looks. Despite this, Wilcox stood firm, insisting that Rose should be fired immediately for causing trouble. Respecting his decision, Mrs. Hillyer offered to communicate it to the maid. As she left the room, Buddy ran to the living room to inform his siblings about what would happen next. Upon learning that Rose would be fired, Dahl argued that although their maid had bitten a police officer's thumb, it wasn't a good reason to dismiss her. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hillyer went to Rose's room only to discover that she had a high fever. Worried, she immediately called for an ambulance, which arrived shortly afterward. As Rose was placed on the stretcher, she insisted that she didn't need to go to the hospital, fearing that she would just expire there. However, Mrs. Hillyer and her children comforted her, promising that she would get better with treatment. After the maid was taken to the ambulance, Mrs. Hillyer asked her children to join her in prayer for Rose. Later, the family visited Rose in the hospital and learned that she was suffering from severe pneumonia. Despite this, Dr. Martinson praised the patient's strength, noting that it had helped her survive the serious illness. Days later, the family brought Rose home to recover. While eating on a rainy day, the maid told Buddy how kind the doctor was, revealing that he had once had tears in his eyes just from hearing her heartbeat. Hearing this, Buddy expressed doubts about the doctor, a sentiment that his father shared. Later, Dr. Martinson arrived to check on Rose's condition. During dinner, Wilcox grew uncomfortable, realizing that the doctor was taking too long in the maid's room. Mrs. Hillyer then reassured him, assuring him that Dr. Martinson was a trained professional. Worried, Buddy and his father got up to check on how Rose was doing. They encountered the doctor on the stairs, who had just finished the checkup and reported that the maid was improving. Despite this, both father and son looked at him with suspicion as he left the house. The next day, the family attended Mass with Rose, who seemed to have finally changed her promiscuous ways. However, one day, Wilcox caught her bringing a man named Billy to their home. Rose explained that the man was a good person and wanted to marry her, but he couldn't because he was poor and unemployed. Despite her explanation, Wilcox became upset and looked for Billy's clothes to throw them outside. Rose continued to defend her position, pleading not to be fired. However, he was not convinced and immediately dismissed her, insisting that she pack her things. The next morning, Wilcox excitedly told Rose that he had found her a job in Tennessee. However, when the maid learned it was a job on a dairy farm, she suddenly began to cry. Mrs. Hillyer then reprimanded her husband for making the maid relive her troubled past. Although Wilcox clarified that it wasn't the same farm where she had grown up, the tearful Rose explained that she didn't want to raise a child on a farm, revealing that she was pregnant. Hearing this, Wilcox felt disappointed, fearing that the dairy farm employer would likely reject Rose due to her pregnancy. Mrs. Hillyer comforted the crying Rose and asked who the father of the child was. The woman revealed that the man was out of town and hadn't left a forwarding address. Wilcox then began to doubt whether she was telling the truth. But Rose insisted that she was really expecting a child, sharing that she hadn't had her period in 3 months and that her abdomen was growing. Not convinced, Wilcox demanded that Rose lift her dress to prove her pregnancy. Despite Mrs. Hillyer's shock at the inappropriate request, her husband insisted, assuring her that Rose just needed to show her belly. The maid complied, revealing her stomach. Still doubtful, the couple took Rose to the hospital to confirm the situation, only to discover that she had an ovarian cyst, not a pregnancy. Furthermore, Dr. Martinson later revealed that Rose actually had untreated gonorrhea, which meant she would never be able to have children. Upon learning this, Mrs. Hillyer felt deep sympathy for Rose. Later in the conversation, the doctor recommended a complete radical hysterectomy for Rose, explaining that it would involve the removal of her uterus and both ovaries. He noted that the procedure could result in a less feminine appearance and reduce her promiscuity. When Mrs. Hillyer showed confusion, the doctor clarified that, in addition to the ovarian cyst, Rose was an extreme psychoneurotic with uncontrolled impulses. He suggested that removing the second ovary would free Rose from the suffering she caused herself and others. When Wilcox agreed to sterilize the maid, Mrs. Hillyer objected, calling it a sin. She persuaded her husband to reconsider by reminding him of his considerate and kind nature. As a result, he retracted his decision and chose not to remove Rose's femininity. Next, Mrs. Hillyer confronted the doctor, insisting that the surgery should only remove the ovarian cyst. The medical professional assured her that another surgeon would perform the procedure. After the surgery, Wilcox informed his family that Rose's operation was successful and that she was finally well. When Rose returned home, she resumed her duties and promised to pay the hospital bills. Wilcox, however, insisted that she didn't have to worry about the payment, even though she offered to work as a waitress to cover the cost. One afternoon, Rose confided in Buddy about her plans to leave. During their conversation, she revealed that she had run away from home at the age of 14 and had survived by working as a waitress. When Buddy asked about her family, Rose shared that her father was terrible, while her mother was as kind as Mrs. Hillyer but had passed away along with her sister due to typhoid fever and tuberculosis. Before saying goodbye, she advised him that girls value love above physical moments. That night, after a lovely date with David, Rose was excited when he expressed the desire to see her again the next morning. She rushed inside to share the news with the Hillyer couple, revealing that she had found her Mr. Right, the police officer whose thumb she had bitten. Not long after, Rose married David, and the Hillyers attended the ceremony. After the reception, she sincerely bid farewell, expressing her deep gratitude and love for the family. However, this profoundly affected Buddy, who felt heartbroken after hugging her one last time. On the way home, Wilcox joked about how happy he was to see Rose content and finally out of their lives. Mrs. Hillyer laughed, acknowledging that Rose had found love, but hoping it wouldn't be too overwhelming for David. When she asked Buddy for his opinion, the teenager couldn't respond because he was still crying. In the present day, Buddy reflects on his former maid's journey, revealing that David was not actually her Mr. Right. It turned out that Rose had 4 more husbands before finally finding the right one, with whom she had been married for 25 years. Upon entering the house, Buddy calls for his father and finds him in the garden. They talk on the porch, where Wilcox delivers the painful news that Rose has passed away. Overwhelmed with grief, Buddy cries, but his father offers comfort, reminding him that she lived a full life. As they look at the river, Wilcox assures his son that Rose will always be in their hearts.